A single candle flickers inside a silent plantation room. Shadows crawl across the walls like ghosts refusing to rest. A voice whispers through the darkness. Not every scream was heard. Not every crime was written. We talk about the whips, the chains, the cotton fields. But there were other horrors, hidden ones, buried in silence behind locked doors, smothered by fear. The world saw the pain it could measure, but ignored the pain it could not face. Some of the most disturbing crimes of slavery weren't public, they were private, quiet, and filthy in their cruelty. This is the story of those hidden crimes, the abuse enslaved men could never speak of, and history never wanted you to know. Because some wounds never healed, they were simply erased. The year is the 1800s. Across the American South, the air is heavy with heat and hierarchy. Enslaved Africans are forced into lives of endless labor. Bodies owned, spirits broken, dignity stolen. Every plantation runs like a machine of control, turning human lives into profit. But within that system, there are layers of power, layers of fear. And at the very bottom stand the men whose pain had no language. Enslaved men were expected to be strong, unbreakable, silent. But that strength became their curse, a reason to exploit, to punish, to dominate. They were forced to carry pain that no one was allowed to see. What did it mean to be both feared and powerless at the same time? To stand tall under the sun, yet be stripped of your humanity in the shadows. Power on the plantation was absolute. It infected everything it touched. Every meal, every command, every glance. Masters controlled through fear, overseers enforced through violence, and everyone learned one rule: obedience or death. The system was designed not just to use bodies, but to erase the idea of resistance. Public punishments turned into theater, designed to destroy dignity and make rebellion unthinkable. Men were whipped not only for disobedience, but to remind everyone watching what power looked like. Power was a disease, spreading from master to overseer, from overseer to servant, until cruelty became routine. But what happened in public was only half the story. Behind closed doors, the silence grew louder. Some of the worst acts of slavery could not be spoken aloud. Acts that crossed every moral line. Acts meant not just to control, but to completely break the enslaved. When silence becomes the only way to survive, truth begins to rot inside the soul. That's how these crimes stayed hidden. Many enslaved men endured forms of abuse that could never be admitted, not even to one another. They lived in fear, humiliated, stripped of agency, reduced to objects of domination. This was not about attraction, it was about control, about reminding the enslaved that even their bodies were not their own. Imagine living in a world where saying no could mean death, where your only weapon was silence. That silence became armor and a prison. The enslaved learned quickly. To survive, you speak less, feel less, hope less. You live quietly, invisibly. Because in a world built on exploitation, to be noticed was to be in danger. Silence became their only language, a language of survival, built from glances, from stillness, from swallowing pain until it burned from the inside. For enslaved men, every moment carried risk. To resist was to die. To speak was to invite punishment. To exist was to endure. And yet, in the hidden corners of plantations, new horrors unfolded. The kind no one would write about, the kind no history book dared to explain. Power didn't stop at the edge of the field. It followed them into the cabins, into the workrooms, into the quiet moments where fear was thick as the air. They were stripped of choice, stripped of protection, stripped of voice. Every act of exploitation was designed to remind them that nothing, not even their dignity, belonged to them. The cruelty was systematic. It wasn't passion, it wasn't personal. It was policy, a brutal reminder that power could do whatever it pleased. It wasn't about desire, one historian later wrote. It was about domination. And domination became the heartbeat of the slave system, unspeakable, unrecorded, and deliberate. For many, silence was a form of survival. The enslaved learned to carry their pain without words, to hide it behind calloused hands and steady eyes. Speaking of it, even after freedom, could bring shame, disbelief, or death. Some truths were simply too heavy for the world to hear. Imagine the weight of that silence, a truth so dark that it could never be told, not even to those who shared the same suffering. For them, silence wasn't weakness. It was the only way to live another day. Because on the plantation, even your agony could be used against you. Letters, diaries, and court records tell fragments of what happened. A mistress writing of a servant she kept too close. Overseers whispering about punishments that went too far. Abolitionists recording rumors of cruelty no one dared confirm. The evidence was always there, hidden in the spaces between words, in the pages torn out, in the stories that ended too soon. Historians now trace those shadows, piecing together a truth that generations tried to erase. A truth about the hidden crimes of slavery, where power became obsession and domination became a kind of madness. The enslaved men who endured this lived with constant fear and confusion. Their bodies carried pain that their voices could never express. Every day they walked among their oppressors, forced to act normal, forced to serve, forced to forget. But trauma does not vanish. It buries itself deep, waiting. To enslave the body is one thing. To enslave the soul. That was the real purpose of slavery. The system didn't just want labor. It wanted control of the human spirit. It wanted to crush self-worth so completely that rebellion would die before it was born. But history is cruel in another way. Even after emancipation, the truth was denied again. The world wanted stories of noble masters and gentle mistresses, not stories of what really happened behind closed doors. They rewrote history in soft words, washing away the blood and shame until plantations became postcards of Southern nostalgia. They cleaned the story until it shined. They called it heritage. But every polished word was built on silence, the same silence that once protected the guilty. The truth doesn't vanish just because no one writes it down. It waits. It lingers in the air, in the soil, in the memories of descendants who feel the weight of something unnamed. Today, scholars and families dig through archives, uncovering letters, testimonies, and oral histories. The whispers of the past finally breaking through. Every document, every recovered voice is an act of resistance, a small light in the darkness that once consumed generations. Because the crimes that were buried are not gone. They live in inherited pain, in the mistrust of systems, in the generational trauma that shapes communities even now. The abuse did not end when the chains were broken. It lived on in silence, in fear, in the way history chose to forget. To heal, we must first remember. To remember is to face what was never meant to be spoken. History often celebrates the powerful, the ones who wrote the rules, who built the monuments, who claimed civilization. But the truth belongs to the silenced, to those who endured what others denied. They were men stripped of everything, yet they endured. Their silence was not surrender, it was survival. Their endurance was resistance. When power turned into exploitation, when cruelty became normal, they still found a way to exist, to live, to pass their blood into a freer future. And that, in itself, was defiance. To speak their story now is not to reopen wounds. It is to finally let them heal. To remember them is to restore humanity to those the world tried to erase. The final truth is this: they were never voiceless. They were silenced. And now, the silence ends. They were told that freedom had arrived, that chains were gone, and the world had changed. But the silence of centuries doesn't end with the crack of a document. It lingers. It moves from body to blood, from memory to instinct. The men who once had no voice became fathers and grandfathers who spoke carefully, who hid their pain behind hard eyes and clenched hands. Their silence became inherited, not because they chose it, but because the world never asked to hear it. After emancipation, the country began its cleansing. Plantation owners rewrote their journals, turning crimes into discipline, turning domination into care. They washed their hands with ink, telling the story of a kind and noble South, while the ground beneath them still reeked of sweat and blood. Historians followed that lie, polishing it until it gleamed with civility. Museums displayed silver spoons and gowns, but not the screams that echoed through those halls. And so, the hidden crimes were buried again, this time under polite conversation, under patriotism, under nostalgia. But a buried truth doesn't die. It waits. It seeps through photographs, through whispered stories, through the trembling in a descendant's voice when they realize what their ancestors endured. In the 1930s, the WPA recordings captured the words of the once enslaved. Some men, even after decades of freedom, still couldn't speak of certain things. They'd pause, they'd fall silent, they'd change the subject. The interviewers moved on, but the silence said everything. It was the language of trauma. Modern historians, Black scholars, and descendants now return to those archives, reading between the pauses, between the words left unsaid. They uncover the patterns, names erased, children unacknowledged, crimes written off as rumor. Each discovery is like pulling a body from the water. Heavy, painful, but necessary. Because only by seeing the full horror can we understand the resilience it took to survive it. The abuse of enslaved men was not just physical, it was spiritual mutilation. It told them they could not protect, could not resist, could not even own their own skin. And yet, within that horror, they found ways to endure. Through faith, through song, through a stubborn kind of hope that defied every effort to destroy them. Their endurance was a form of rebellion, their silence, a weapon of survival. Even now, the echoes remain. In every conversation about power, masculinity, and race, the shadow of that history looms. The stereotypes of aggression, of strength without vulnerability. They were born in the plantations, crafted by those who feared the men they enslaved. The fear that justified cruelty became the myth that justified inequality. And so, the hidden crimes of the past still shape the world we walk in today. The historian's task is not to comfort, but to confront. To dig into the filth that polite society would rather forget. Because this is not just about what was done, it's about what was denied. For centuries, these men were stripped of their humanity. To tell their story now is to give that humanity back, to restore dignity to those who were denied it. They were men, fathers, brothers, sons, forced to bear pain they could never name. Their stories were silenced, but their spirits were not. They live in every act of remembrance, in every voice that dares to tell the truth.